Okay, ladies and gents, so been a bit busy, obviously, between a full-time teaching job and trying to do my master's degree and be a dad. I don't have a lot of time to be able to put these together, but I try and scrape out some time wherever I can to produce something for you. It also helps me with my classes occasionally when I have to describe something if I've kind of gone through a practice run beforehand. In this particular video, I want to cover a few little details from texturing as well as some procedural masking of details related to some of the other videos that have been released in the recent past. And hopefully you'll get something interesting from it. If not, well, so be it. I'm just going to run through some dynamic masking to deal with borders, some ways of adding erosion to steep angles, and some alternative methods of thinking about materials, textures. So if that interests you, stay tuned, otherwise you can head off to another video. So I've got a mountain here. I've set it to natural, and the reason why I've done this is I wanted actually to have really steep peaks to kind of explain the issues with steep peaks. Now, when we run a displace on it, that gives more for the erosion to work with, right? There's more little details for it to kind of collide with and bounce around and do its thing. And in this particular case, I've gone ahead and taken a purlin, and I could have just gone ahead and shortened it here, but occasionally I like to just use a constant node. Just remind people that this can be used to control height, and plug that in and set the height there, and combining them, set to max, we can see the two of them. So we get the full height of one and the full height of the other, and a seam, of course, where they blend between. Now, if you watch Dax's intentional orphaned videos or mixing multiple terrains and stuff like that, you're aware of these seams and aware of how you can fix them. You can go directly to the mask, plug it in, and you can hand paint in the 2D view where the seam is, and then you can run an erosion on just that region. And I'm doing the same thing, except I'm not painting the mask. Why wouldn't I paint the mask? That's faster. Well, yes, painting the mask is faster if you have a one-off and making one terrain only. It's going to be faster to do that. It's the most logical choice. But what if, let's say I wanted to make a whole bunch of mountains of the same type. I want to go ahead and hit, change the random seed, using the mutate option. And I want it to sort of use this as a template for creating a lot of different mountains of the same type. Because I want to create a whole bunch of these assets that I want to bring in, say, into Maya or Unreal or 3D Zoom Max or Cinema 4D or whatever. And I want a whole field of different kinds of mountains that I want to handle separately. Well, if that's the case, then if I want them all to kind of have the same elements, hand painting that mask is going to be different every single time. So every time I do one, I'm going to have to redo the mask. Not ideal. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one of the original shapes. So it could be the mountain, it could be the ground. It doesn't matter which one. I'm going to take the combined version where it's both of them together. And then I'm going to do the difference between the combined and the single. And what this does is it gives me the actual seam that's present here. Now you notice this is heavily bulged. And that's because I went ahead and did a levels and a logarithmic adjustment. And between both of these, what it does is it really pushes a lot of details really high. And it tends to take this seam and make it really steep. The reason why I've done this is because this gives me more control. I have a different kind of range of height information to use the height node on, so that when I bring it down to 1% and 1% and 100% here, that I get a really sharp angle. If I had left it without that levels and logarithmic adjustment, my seam would still be a little bit blurry. So this basically just makes sure that it's really crisp. So that's why I did that. Now I'm also doing a curvature. In the curvature, you can see the settings here, 10, 50 and 33, and I've set it to horizontal. And that's ensured that I've grabbed just the edge, nothing but the edge. These are, a darker gray, but they're not heavily selected. I'm going to do an aperture to that, and it's going to expand it. Now, again, keep in mind the difference between 2D, which is what this is calculated as, versus what we see as a 3D preview. If we look in this mode, we can see that the two regions are the same. Along that seam, you can tell that they're the same length. They don't look it, but they definitely are. When we look at it in a 3D view, this steep height looks much larger than it is. And this is one of the issues that we're going to deal with, in that when we go to erode, we have a small region like this, and you see how small that is, being represented for this entire area on the height map. And that means that there's a lot less that it can do with this information here for, say, something like an erosion. So in this particular case, we may think that it's a really big selection, I have to make it smaller. No. We're good. But I'm going to erode this area, so I'll just soften that, and it'll look much bigger here than it actually is. And we'll just kind of relax about that. So we're going to plug it into the erosion, precipitation amount, and we're going to plug it into the area. And all that's going to do is between this and this, you see it erodes just that small region. And that's just cleaning up the seam. Okay, so moving on, we're now going to go into what we have to deal with what is essentially a fairly steep mountain slope. It's not as steep as it could be, but it's steeper than, say, I want. Now, I'm not too worried about the erosion kind of at the very peak, but in this middle region down into the base, I am. If this was a cliff, it would be much easier to deal with. I could basically stretch it in one region, and I would take something like, this distance here, depending on the height that it represents, so how tall it is, represents the angle of that slope. So I only have just this area to do the calculation, and that it covers what seems like a really long sloped region because of the steepness. If I take that and I change the angle by, stretching it or something like that, or stretching that region, I can make what looks like a less angled slope, and it's closer in representation in height as it is in width, right? So the width and the height information is close to the same, right? So closer to, like, say, a 45-degree angle, or even, more shallow. So if that's a representation, then when I do erosion, I can have a lot more detail in that area. So that's the goal. Now, if it's a slope, easy, one direction deform, right? I can go stretch it, no problem. Take it into Photoshop and stretch it here with the transform tools, whatever. But for something circular, how do I stretch that region? Well, the solution for me was to go ahead and do a repulse. So the repulse, I don't save the peak, but these regions down in here, I can get a little bit more detail. So that's what I did. And I went ahead and eroded that. And I wanted to take the details of that erosion and separate them off. So I basically subtracted the repulse from the erosion, and you can tweak this however you want. I managed to get away with 100%. Maybe you won't get away with 100%, maybe you want to tweak it a little bit, but the details that I got from it was enough, and especially in that region. And then I ran a displace on it just to make it even more complicated, setting it to rugged, and then setting it to 2 iterations. So this adds a whole bunch of erosion detail that's complex, and we're going to look at what just a regular erosion by itself in its current form would have done. So a regular erosion would have done this, and you see it's all soft and smooth, and these big piles of debris, right, always are very smooth themselves. and there's not a ton of detail. So I took the where from this, ignoring things like the deposit and the flow, and I did a recurve on that. The recurve is just going to sharpen some ridges and create sort of a curvature to some of these forms, and then I'm going to erode, or rather subtract, with that. So instead of this, I'm getting this. So I'm getting some big broad shapes, I'm getting those grooves that I still wanted, and I'm maintaining some of the noisy detail that came from the original shape. So I've got a bunch of detail still in there. Looks kind of soft, but detailed, rather than completely smoothed out. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to combine it with another subtraction of all that erosion detail that I did that I displaced. So again, I could have had just this with a single erosion, but in doing this process, I now have this. So I'm coming off the original merged form here to that. And it has a lot more detail in it. But I'm not quite finished with it. I'm going to take a Voronoi, set and scale small. I've added dual, so there's another layer of Voronoi kind of blended as sort of max in between it. I've set it to S-type, which is more of like a rocky shape, as opposed to sort of peaks and valleys. The valleys here in this particular type is very sharp. So it's more of a linear transition from the very top peak to the valley, and then back up again. It creates sort of sharp grooves, which works nice. I'm going to do it to just the height region that I want, which is mainly in this region here. I'll add a tiny amount here, and I'm not doing really much to the peak, because I'm okay with the shape of the peak. Right? It's got enough detail in it already. So adding that in a very small, subtle amount, so only 3% because these are super huge. And what it's created is all these little sort of ridges. So unlike ridges that would be coming from something like Stratify or the terracing, these things are not completely even and straight. Which, I mean, you can change that in the terracing. You can plug in like another noise, something like that, to break up the shape of them. But kind of all at the same time, and getting a break up to these ridges, and they're not like even all the way around, and they're not even in shape. So it's just a faster way of just breaking up this thing and getting sort of like little ridges. Okay, so now I've got my shape. Let's say I'm kind of happy with that. I mean, I can go ahead and take the snow here, which is what I've done, and sort of smooth out some of this bottom region. But I didn't want to take all of it. I wanted to keep some of the detail that was there, because snow will just really soften all of this area. I wanted to sort of lift it up and kind of deal with some of the cracks, but I didn't want to lose a lot of the detail. So that's going to represent my original shape, but I'm going to do a lot of the calculations off of this more detailed version. So, as usual, I've got a soil, and then I do a soil on that soil. I've done this tons of times before, and I use this to generate two areas of color. I've got my area of my base colors of stone and my base colors of grass. So for grass, I've got this and this. So really noisy details, plenty of contrast in there. Here this provides like a nice color base, and it's got a fair bit of contrast in it as well. And when I combine them together, kind of adjusting the ratio between them, I get a nice soft kind of blend between darker regions and light, tiny, noisy details. Going into this with slope to try and isolate sort of the top regions of these things. I'm going to use this to help me break up where the grass exists and where it doesn't exist. But if I just go ahead with kind of like pure color transition, where it's just sort of a sharp fall off, it's not necessarily ideal. So what I did is I ran a curvature, vertical, and just fall off, and then inverted that to get something a little bit different from this. Just kind of expanding on that region. So I've got the original area and the expansion. Taking this original shape, or color rather, darkening it heavily using, I believe I used either gamma or levels, gamma. So I brought it down to 0.6. And this new mask, what I've done is I've taken this, and around the areas where it's going to be cut out, I've darkened. And that means it transitions from a light color to a dark region around the edge. I could have also done this as maybe making it a bit more brown or something, or desaturated, to give, say, the illusion of it transitioning to maybe dead grass. This is entirely up to you, but I wanted it to sort of like go from like bright, vibrant grass to the edges being a bit darker. And the end result of that, of course, you see here. So the lighter regions, it goes into darker and it blends into that dirt a lot nicer. Whereas if I had not done this, it would feel a bit more fake. It's like it just been slapped on, which is not ideal. So I'm using the slope to cut that out, but this other slope to help darken those regions. How about the this mountain thing? So again, that soil and soil, it's giving me two different colors that I'm going to blend between. So I've got this one, which has got some nice contrasty values between light and dark. And this other one that has a lot of detail, variation in saturation. And when I blend them together, I get a blend of both. So I've dropped the overall richness of this, which is going to come back through the process of blending multiple things anyways. But I've got a lot of variation in detail in this initial base color. Now, I wanted to add some sort of grooves in there. So what I did is I took the secondary erosion, which I'm not using the shape of, but I'm using it to drive another version of soil. The soil, of course, is very different in shape and form from this one. There's a lot more sweeping shapes that come from it. By doing that, I can go ahead and add the darkening version of this in these sweeping forms, and I got a new layer of complexity. It feels like the dirt is kind of sweeping away from this original rock structure. Now I want to emphasize the grooves a little bit further, and of course erosion does that very well with flow. With flow it goes with those grooves. So I just reused my darkened version here once again in the mixer. Instead of just a blend combine, I'm using a multiply, and then I'm controlling the amount. So now I'm going from this, from here to the sweeping dirt shapes to the darker cracks and fissures to really kind of bring them up. And that's not all. I would like to pick up some of these upper regions in here and get some, just a little bit more variation. All the dirt is sweeping down to the bottom. I want all that dirt to kind of have that place to exist. But up here it's more of like a rocky thing. It's more exposed to sunlight. Maybe it's getting a little bit more bleached. So I'm taking my original texture and I'm bleaching it. Right? Rich, dark, moist. And this is more dry and desaturated. And blending them, I end up with this nice transition. So I'm getting a lot of different color detail across the whole surface, and it's just from a few initial calculations, just playing with these masks and just thinking my way through, you know, the general idea process. And then combining them together, and I get here. And I could always take it further. I could go add in a bit more greenery, maybe in these upper regions or not. That's entirely up to you. There's lots of additional layers that you can add to this, and often it comes from just looking at reference, right? You can choose these colors, you can adjust these colors with things like color effects to make them less saturated, more in the cold region, or more warm, whatever you like. But hopefully this has given you a bit more insight into sort of texturing and detailing, and let's see what you can do with it. Anyways, that's it for this particular video. I hope to produce another one soon if I can find the time, and I'll see you in that one.